In the winter of 1857, in Hanover County, Virginia, a peculiar incident would set in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the antebellum South. What began as what observers dismissed as a simple act of defiance by an enslaved woman would ultimately reveal a web of deception that had been meticulously maintained for over 2 decades. The Whitmore plantation sat on nearly 800 acres of tobacco-rich soil, approximately 12 miles northeast of Richmond. The main house, a Georgian colonial structure built in 1798, commanded a view of the James River from its elevated position. Behind the house, a series of outbuildings stretched toward the tobacco fields, the smokehouse, the dairy, the overseer's quarters, and further back, the slave quarters arranged in 2 neat rows. According to county records, the plantation was owned by Harrison Whitmore, aged 43, who had inherited the property from his father in 1834. Whitmore was described by contemporaries as a reserved man who rarely entertained and seldom left his property except for necessary business in Richmond. His wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth in 1841, leaving behind no surviving children. The household was managed with the assistance of an enslaved woman named Celia, who had been with the family since 1836. County tax records from 1857 list her as 29 years old, though such documentation was often imprecise. What made Celia notable among the 32 enslaved individuals on the Whitmore property was her position as head of the household staff and her unusual level of literacy, a skill that was both legally forbidden and practically dangerous for an enslaved person to possess. On the morning of February 14, 1857, a traveling merchant named Samuel Hartwell arrived at the plantation to conduct business with Whitmore. Hartwell later provided testimony to county authorities that would become crucial to understanding subsequent events. According to his statement filed with the Hanover County Courthouse, he observed what appeared to be a routine interaction between Whitmore and Celia that struck him as oddly formal for a master addressing household staff. Hartwell noted that Whitmore addressed Celia by name and consulted with her regarding household supplies in a manner that seemed more consultative than commanding. When Hartwell commented on this to Whitmore, suggesting that the enslaved woman appeared well-trained in household management, Whitmore's response was described as unusually defensive. The merchant recorded in his journal that evening that something in the exchange had felt rehearsed. What Hartwell could not have known was that this seemingly minor observation would later be recognized as evidence of an elaborate performance that had been maintained for years. The truth was far more complex than the simple master-slave relationship it appeared to represent. Life on the Whitmore plantation followed the rigid patterns common to Virginia tobacco operations of the era. The enslaved population was divided between field hands and house servants, with strict hierarchies governing interaction between the groups. Celia's position at the top of the household hierarchy was unusual, but not unprecedented. What was remarkable, according to later testimonies from other enslaved individuals, was the degree of autonomy she exercised in managing not just domestic affairs, but also certain business correspondence. Former field hand Moses Jenkins, who escaped to Pennsylvania in 1859, provided testimony to abolitionists that was later published in the Richmond Inquirer. Jenkins described observing Celia reading correspondence aloud to Whitmore in the evenings, a practice that struck him as backward from the usual arrangement. More curious still was Jenkins's account of seeing Celia writing in ledger books, apparently conducting business calculations related to tobacco sales and plantation expenses. The physical arrangement of the plantation reflected the social hierarchies of the time, but with subtle variations that would later prove significant. Celia's quarters were located not in the slave quarters, but in a small building attached to the main house, connected by a covered walkway that had been constructed in 1842, shortly after Margaret Whitmore's death. This building, originally intended as servants' quarters, provided direct access to the main house while maintaining the appearance of separate accommodations. Neighbors rarely visited the Whitmore plantation, and Whitmore discouraged social calls. The few visitors who did arrive were received in the formal parlor and rarely saw the interior workings of the household. This isolation was not unusual for plantation owners who preferred to maintain strict control over their operations. But it also served to shield the unusual arrangements within the household from outside scrutiny. The tobacco harvest of 1856 had been particularly successful, generating substantial profits that required careful management and correspondence with Richmond tobacco merchants. It was during this period that the first cracks began to appear in the carefully maintained facade that had governed the plantation for years. On January 8, 1857, a letter arrived from Richmond merchant Thomas Bradley regarding a discrepancy in tobacco shipment records. The letter was addressed to H. Whitmore, but contained references to previous correspondence that Whitmore could not account for. When he confronted Celia about the matter, her response revealed a level of knowledge about business affairs that went far beyond what would be expected of household staff. According to a diary entry later discovered in the main house, Whitmore recorded his growing unease about the situation. The entry, dated January 22, 1857, noted that Celia had been conducting correspondence with merchants using his name, and that several business decisions had been made without his direct knowledge. More troubling still was his realization that these decisions had consistently resulted in favorable outcomes for the plantation's finances. The diary entries revealed a pattern of behavior that had developed gradually over years. Following his wife's death in 1841, Whitmore had increasingly relied on Celia for assistance with matters that required literacy and mathematical skills. What had begun as simple assistance with reading correspondence had evolved into a situation where Celia was effectively managing significant aspects of the plantation's business operations. As winter progressed into spring of 1857, the arrangement that had functioned smoothly for years began to show signs of strain. Whitmore's diary entries from this period reveal a man struggling with the implications of his dependence on an enslaved woman for crucial business decisions. The legal and social ramifications of such an arrangement were potentially devastating, not only for his reputation, but for his very survival in Virginia society. The incident that would eventually expose the true nature of the Whitmore household arrangements began with what appeared to be a simple mistake. On the afternoon of March 3, 1857, a delegation from the Hanover County Courthouse arrived at the plantation to deliver legal documents related to a property tax dispute. The delegation consisted of Clerk Benjamin Foster, Assessor William Crawford, and Deputy Sheriff James Morrison. According to the official report filed by Foster, the men were initially received by Whitmore in the main house parlor. However, during the course of their discussion about property boundaries and tax assessments, it became apparent that Whitmore lacked specific knowledge about recent correspondence with county officials regarding the matter. When Foster requested to see the relevant documents, Whitmore's response was described as evasive and confused. The situation became more complicated when Celia entered the parlor, ostensibly to serve refreshments, and immediately demonstrated detailed knowledge of the very documents and correspondence that Whitmore had been unable to locate or explain. Foster's report noted that Celia not only knew the location of the documents, but also provided accurate summaries of their contents and relevant dates. What followed was a moment of recognition that would have far-reaching consequences. Foster, An experienced county clerk who had dealt with numerous plantation owners over his career immediately recognized that something in the dynamic between Whitmore and Celia was fundamentally different from the standard master-slave relationship. The level of knowledge Celia displayed about business and legal matters, combined with Whitmore's apparent dependence on her information, suggested a role reversal that challenged the basic assumptions of plantation hierarchy. The delegation left the plantation that afternoon with their business unresolved and with growing suspicions about the true nature of the Whitmore household. Foster's report, filed with county authorities 3 days later, noted irregularities in the management structure and recommended further investigation. Word of the unusual situation at the Whitmore plantation began to circulate through Hanover County's social networks with the kind of urgency that accompanied any challenge to established social order. Within weeks, the incident had become the subject of widespread speculation and concern among local plantation owners who recognized the potential implications of allowing such arrangements to go unchallenged. The months following the county delegation's visit were marked by increasing isolation and tension at the Whitmore plantation. Neighbors who had previously maintained cordial, if distant, relationships with Whitmore began to withdraw their social connections entirely. Business relationships with Richmond merchants became strained as rumors about the plantation's management spread through commercial networks. For Celia, the exposure brought a new level of danger. The literacy and business acumen that had made her valuable to Whitmore now made her a target for those who viewed educated enslaved people as a threat to the social order. The delicate balance that had allowed the arrangement to function for years was rapidly dissolving under external pressure. Whitmore's diary entries from April 1857 reveal a man caught between impossible choices. Maintaining the arrangement that had proven economically beneficial risked social and legal consequences that could destroy him. Abandoning it meant accepting his own limitations and potentially facing financial ruin due to his lack of business acumen. The situation reached a critical point in late April when Richmond tobacco merchant Edward Garrison arrived at the plantation for what he described as a routine business visit. Garrison had been dealing with the Whitmore plantation for several years and had developed what he believed to be a good working relationship with Harrison Whitmore through their correspondence. However, when Garrison met with Whitmore in person, he quickly discovered significant discrepancies between the man he met and the business partner he had come to know through written communication. The sophisticated understanding of tobacco markets and shipping logistics that characterized their correspondence was notably absent from Whitmore's verbal communications. More troubling still was Whitmore's apparent unfamiliarity with decisions and agreements that had been made in his name over the previous months. Garrison's suspicions were confirmed when he observed Celia consulting with Whitmore during their meeting, providing information that Whitmore then relayed as his own knowledge. The merchant left the plantation convinced that the correspondence he had been receiving was not authored by Harrison Whitmore, despite bearing his signature. Upon returning to Richmond, Garrison shared his observations with other merchants in the tobacco trade. The revelation that plantation business might be conducted by an enslaved person created alarm throughout the merchant community, raising questions about the validity of contracts and the legal standing of business relationships that had been conducted under such circumstances. The merchant community's concerns quickly reached legal authorities. In May 1857, Hanover County Magistrate Thomas Pemberton ordered a formal investigation into the business practices of the Whitmore plantation. The investigation would focus not only on the irregular management arrangements, but also on the legal implications of contracts and agreements that might have been made under false pretenses. As summer arrived, the investigation began in earnest. county authorities interviewed neighboring plantation owners, business associates, and former visitors to the Whitmore property. The testimonies that emerged painted a picture of an arrangement that had evolved gradually over years, becoming more elaborate and risky as it developed. Dr. Charles Manning, who had served as the area's physician since 1845, provided testimony that shed light on the origins of the unusual arrangement. According to Manning, Harrison Whitmore had suffered what appeared to be a significant head injury in a riding accident in 1842, shortly after his wife's death. The injury had left Whitmore with persistent difficulties in reading and mathematical calculation, though he had managed to conceal these limitations from most observers. Manning's testimony suggested that Celia's increasing involvement in plantation business had begun as a practical necessity following Whitmore's injury. What had started as assistance with basic correspondence had gradually expanded as both Whitmore and Celia recognized her superior abilities in managing business affairs. The arrangement had proven so successful financially that it had continued and expanded over the course of 15 years. The investigation also revealed the elaborate measures that had been taken to maintain the deception. Former overseer Jonathan Hayes, who had left the plantation in 1855, testified that he had observed Celia practicing Whitmore's signature, and that business correspondence was typically composed by her before being copied and signed by Whitmore. Hayes noted that Whitmore's business acumen had seemed to improve dramatically after his wife's death, when in fact he had been increasingly relying on Celia's knowledge and skills. Perhaps most revealing was the testimony of former house servant Ruth Collins, who had been sold to another plantation in 1854. Collins described observing evening sessions where Celia would instruct Whitmore on business matters, preparing him for upcoming meetings with merchants or county officials. According to Collins, these sessions often involved Celia explaining financial documents and coaching Whitmore on appropriate responses to potential questions. The investigation uncovered evidence that the arrangement had extended beyond simple business assistance. Financial records showed that many of the plantation's most profitable decisions over the previous decade had originated with Celia's analysis of market conditions and crop management strategies. The tobacco yields and profit margins achieved by the Whitmore plantation during this period were notably superior to those of neighboring properties. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the case presented unprecedented legal and social challenges. Virginia law provided no framework for addressing a situation where an enslaved person had effectively been managing the business affairs of a white property owner. The legal status of contracts and agreements made under such circumstances was entirely unclear. The social implications were equally complex. The revelation that an enslaved woman possessed superior business skills to those of a white plantation owner challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and capability that underpinned the entire social system of the antebellum South. The case threatened to expose the arbitrary nature of a system that assumed inherent superiority based on race rather than actual ability. By August 1857, pressure from neighboring plantation owners and Richmond's business community had reached a point where legal action became inevitable. County Prosecutor James Morrison filed charges against Harrison Whitmore for fraud and misrepresentation in business dealings. The charges carried potential penalties, including substantial fines and possible imprisonment. Celia faced far more serious consequences. Under Virginia law, an enslaved person who assumed the authority of a white person or engaged in activities that undermined the social order could face severe punishment, including sale to plantations in the Deep South, where conditions were notoriously harsh. The literacy skills that had made her valuable to Whitmore were now evidence of violations that could result in permanent separation from the only home she had known for over 20 years. The trial was scheduled for September 1857, but the proceedings would never take place. On the morning of August 28th, county authorities arrived at the Whitmore plantation to find the main house empty and evidence of hasty departure. Harrison Whitmore and Celia had disappeared during the night, leaving behind no indication of their destination or intentions. The disappearance created a sensation throughout Virginia and beyond. Newspaper accounts of the case appeared in Richmond, Norfolk, and eventually in northern cities, where the story was seized upon by abolitionist publications as evidence of the inherent contradictions and injustices of the slavery system. The image of an enslaved woman whose intelligence and capabilities had exceeded those of her master, while remaining legally classified as property, became a powerful symbol in anti-slavery arguments. The abandoned plantation was eventually sold to satisfy debts and legal obligations, with the proceeds distributed among creditors. The remaining enslaved population was dispersed to other properties throughout the region. The tobacco fields that had flourished under Celia's management gradually declined in productivity under new ownership. Months passed with no word of Harrison Whitmore or Celia. Rewards were posted for their capture and return, but no reliable sightings were reported. Some speculated that they had fled to northern states where slavery was illegal. Others suggested they might have attempted to reach Canada via the Underground Railroad network. A few theorized that they had headed west to territories where their past might be left behind. In December 1857, a letter arrived at the Hanover County Courthouse that provided the first definitive word about the fate of the fugitives. The letter, bearing a Philadelphia postmark but no return address, was signed with initials that County Clerk Benjamin Foster recognized as matching those used in business correspondence from the Whitmore plantation. The letter's author identified herself only as someone who wished to set the record straight about the events at the Whitmore plantation. The correspondence revealed that Harrison Whitmore had died of fever in a rooming house in Baltimore in early October, approximately 6 weeks after their departure from Virginia. The letter's author stated that she had continued north alone and had no intention of returning to Virginia or revealing her current location. What made the letter remarkable was its sophisticated prose and complex reasoning about the moral and legal implications of the case. The author argued that the arrangement at the Whitmore plantation had represented a form of partnership that, while unconventional and legally impossible under Virginia law, had proven beneficial to all parties involved. She questioned the justice of a legal system that would punish competence and success simply because they challenged social expectations about race and capability. The letter concluded with a statement that would be widely quoted in subsequent newspaper accounts. Perhaps the greatest deception was not in our arrangement, but in the assumption that intelligence and capability could be limited by the circumstances of birth or the color of one's skin. County authorities forwarded copies of the letter to law enforcement agencies in Pennsylvania and other northern states, but no arrests were ever made. The case was gradually closed as other matters demanded attention, though it continued to be discussed and debated for years afterward. In 1860, approximately 3 years after the disappearance, a brief notice appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper announcing the death of a woman identified only as C. Marshall. The notice, placed by the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, mentioned that the deceased had contributed significantly to the education of formerly enslaved people in the city and had been instrumental in establishing a school for African American children. While no direct evidence linked this notice to Celia from the Whitmore plantation, certain details in the announcement resonated with those familiar with the Virginia case. The notice mentioned that the deceased had possessed exceptional skills in mathematics and writing, and had often spoken of her previous experience in managing agricultural operations. The Whitmore plantation case became a subject of academic study and legal discussion in the years leading up to the Civil War. Northern newspapers and abolitionist publications cited it as evidence of the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people and the arbitrary nature of racial hierarchies. Southern publications largely ignored the case or dismissed it as an aberration that proved nothing about the general population of enslaved people. Legal scholars debated the implications of the case for contract law and business relationships. If an enslaved person could not legally enter into contracts or make binding business decisions, what was the status of agreements that had been made through such arrangements? The questions raised by the Whitmore case highlighted fundamental contradictions in a legal system that treated some human beings as property while relying on their intelligence and capabilities. The physical remnants of the Whitmore plantation gradually disappeared over the following decades. The main house was demolished in 1872 after years of neglect and deterioration. The slave quarters were torn down around the same time. By 1880, the land had been subdivided and sold to smaller farmers who grew corn and wheat rather than tobacco. Local memory of the case persisted for a generation among those who had witnessed the events firsthand. Elderly residents of Hanover County occasionally shared stories about the unusual situation at the Whitmore place, though details became increasingly unclear as time passed. The stories typically focused on the mystery of the disappearance rather than the complex questions about intelligence, capability, and social hierarchy that the case had raised. In 1895, a researcher from the University of Virginia attempted to document the case as part of a broader study of unusual legal situations in antebellum Virginia. Professor William Henderson interviewed several elderly residents who remembered the events and examined surviving court records and newspaper accounts. His research confirmed many details of the case, but found no additional information about the ultimate fate of Harrison Whitmore or Celia. Henderson's research notes, preserved in the university library, include a reflection on the broader significance of the case. The Whitmore plantation affair represents one of the clearest examples of the intellectual capabilities that existed within the enslaved population, capabilities that were systematically denied recognition and legal protection by the institutions of the time. The researcher also noted the irony that Celia's intelligence and business acumen, which had created prosperity for the Whitmore plantation, had ultimately made her situation untenable within the legal and social framework of Virginia society. Her success had drawn attention that made continued concealment impossible, forcing a choice between exposure and exile. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Whitmore case was occasionally referenced in discussions about education and civil rights. Reformers pointed to it as evidence of the waste and injustice inherent in systems that failed to recognize and develop human potential based on arbitrary social categories. The questions raised by the case remained relevant long after the specific events had faded from immediate memory. How many other arrangements similar to the one at the Whitmore plantation had existed without detection? How many individuals possessed capabilities that were never recognized or developed because of their social status? What potential contributions to society had been lost because legal and social systems prevented their expression? In 1945, nearly 90 years after the original events, historian Margaret Thornton published a comprehensive study of the case titled Intelligence in Bondage: The Whitmore Plantation Affair. Thornton's research drew on previously unused sources, including private letters and diary entries that had been donated to the Virginia Historical Society by descendants of families involved in the case. Thornton's work revealed additional details about the elaborate nature of the deception that had been maintained for years. She documented the sophisticated methods used to maintain the appearance of normal plantation management while concealing the true source of business decisions. The study also highlighted the remarkable risk that both Harrison Whitmore and Celia had accepted in maintaining their arrangement over such an extended period. Perhaps most significantly, Thornton's research identified patterns in business correspondence that suggested the Whitmore case was not entirely unique. She found evidence of several other plantations in Virginia and neighboring states where similar arrangements might have existed, though none had been exposed to the extent of the Whitmore situation. The study concluded with an assessment of the case's historical significance. The Whitmore plantation affair provides a rare glimpse into the complex realities that existed beneath the surface of antebellum Southern society. It demonstrates not only the individual intelligence and capability that could emerge despite systematic oppression, but also the profound contradictions inherent in a social system that depended on denying the very qualities it simultaneously relied upon. Today, the location of the former Whitmore plantation is marked only by a historical marker placed by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources in 1967. The marker briefly summarizes the case and notes its significance in illustrating the complexities of antebellum society. The text avoids taking positions on the moral or legal questions raised by the case, instead presenting it as an example of the unusual circumstances that sometimes emerged within the institution of slavery. Visitors to the site find only rolling farmland that shows no trace of the buildings or activities that once made it the center of controversy throughout Virginia. The tobacco fields have long since been converted to other crops, and the economic prosperity that Celia's management had generated is now only a matter of historical record. The case continues to be studied by historians, legal scholars, and sociologists interested in understanding the complexities of power, intelligence, and social hierarchy in American history. Modern analysis has focused particularly on the questions the case raised about the nature of leadership and capability, and the ways in which social systems can simultaneously depend upon and deny the very qualities they claim to value. Recent scholarship has also examined the case as an early example of what would later be recognized as economic partnerships between individuals of different races, partnerships that challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy while operating within systems that officially prohibited such relationships. The Whitmore plantation arrangement represented a form of collaboration that was economically successful but socially impossible within the legal and cultural framework of the time. The ultimate fate of Celia remains unknown. Despite extensive research and investigation over the decades, no definitive evidence has emerged about her life after the flight from Virginia. The Philadelphia death notice remains the most plausible lead, but it cannot be conclusively verified. What is certain is that her intelligence and capabilities, which had been hidden and denied for years within the slavery system, were eventually expressed in ways that challenged and ultimately transcended the limitations that society had attempted to impose. The silence that surrounds her final years may itself be significant. In an era when the movements and activities of formerly enslaved people were often closely monitored and documented, the absence of records might indicate a successful disappearance into communities where such monitoring was less intensive, or where sympathetic individuals helped maintain anonymity. Some researchers have speculated that she may have continued her educational work in northern cities, contributing to the development of schools and literacy programs for African Americans. Others suggest she might have been involved in Underground Railroad activities, using her intelligence and organizational skills to assist other fugitives from slavery. These theories remain unproven, but reflect the recognition that someone with her demonstrated capabilities would likely have found ways to contribute meaningfully to whatever community she joined. The Whitmore plantation case represents more than just an unusual incident in antebellum Virginia history. It illuminates the complex realities that existed beneath the surface of officially sanctioned social arrangements. The case demonstrates how individual intelligence and capability could emerge and flourish even within systems designed to suppress such qualities, and how the recognition of these qualities could ultimately challenge the basic assumptions upon which those systems depended. The story also highlights the profound personal costs involved in challenging social hierarchies. Both Harrison Whitmore and Celia paid significant prices for their unconventional arrangement. He lost his property, social standing, and ultimately his life. She was forced into permanent exile from the only home she had known. Their experience illustrates the dangers inherent in systems that criminalize recognition of human capability and partnership across racial lines. Perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder that history contains countless stories of intelligence, capability, and achievement that were hidden, denied, or lost because they conflicted with prevailing social expectations. The Whitmore plantation affair provides a rare glimpse into one such story that was briefly exposed to historical view before disappearing again into the silence that surrounds so many suppressed narratives of American history. The questions raised by the case continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about education, opportunity, and social hierarchy. How many other stories of hidden intelligence and thwarted capability remain buried in historical records? What can modern society learn from examples of partnership and collaboration that transcended social boundaries despite official prohibition? How can systems be developed that recognize and cultivate human potential regardless of social background or inherited status? The morning mist that often rises from the James River near the former Whitmore plantation site seems to embody the mystery that continues to surround the case. Like that mist, the story emerges clearly for brief moments before dissolving again into the larger landscape of American history, leaving behind only traces and questions that persist long after the specific details have faded from view. The sound of wind through the trees that have grown up around the old plantation site might remind visitors of the whispered conversations and carefully concealed activities that once took place there. The rustling leaves could echo the turning of pages in ledger books and correspondence that revealed intelligence operating in spaces where it was officially denied recognition. The natural quiet of the rural setting contrasts with the social upheaval that the revelation of truth had caused more than a century and a half ago. For those who pause to consider the significance of this seemingly peaceful farmland, the Whitmore plantation case offers a powerful reminder that the most profound challenges to unjust systems often emerge not from dramatic confrontation, but from the quiet recognition and development of human capabilities that those systems seek to suppress. The collaboration between Harrison Whitmore and Celia represented a form of partnership that was simultaneously illegal, socially impossible, economically successful, and morally necessary within the context of their time. Their story continues to echo through the generations that followed, raising questions that remain as relevant today as they were in 1857. The case stands as testimony to the enduring power of human intelligence and capability to transcend the limitations that social systems attempt to impose, even when such transcendence comes at enormous personal cost. And in the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Celia's remarkable intelligence and capability is not a monument or marker, but the continued examination of the questions her story raises about justice, opportunity, and the recognition of human potential in all its forms. The silence that surrounds her final years speaks as loudly as any documented account could about the complexity of seeking truth and justice within systems that officially prohibited both. The wind that moves through the Virginia countryside carries no answers about where she went or what she accomplished after leaving the plantation. But it carries the certainty that her intelligence, once revealed, could never again be contained or denied, regardless of what social or legal systems might attempt to impose such limitations. In 1962, exactly 105 years after the disappearance, a construction crew working on a highway expansion project near the former plantation site made an unexpected discovery. Buried beneath what had once been the main house's foundation, workers found a small wooden box containing documents that had somehow survived more than a century of neglect and weather. The box contained 3 items: a final letter from Celia to Harrison Whitmore, written shortly before their flight from Virginia, a detailed accounting ledger showing the true extent of her management of the plantation's finances, and a list of names and locations that researchers later identified as part of an informal network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The letter, preserved by the dry conditions beneath the foundation stones, revealed the emotional cost of their arrangement. Celia wrote of the constant fear of discovery, the exhaustion of maintaining deception, and her growing awareness that their partnership, however successful, could never be acknowledged or legitimized within Virginia society. She expressed gratitude for Whitmore's trust, while acknowledging that their situation had become untenable. Most significantly, the letter contained her final assessment of their years together. What we accomplished proved that intelligence and capability recognize no boundaries of birth or circumstance. Perhaps that proof was worth the price we must now pay for having demonstrated it. The accounting ledger provided concrete evidence of the sophistication of her financial management. The records showed profit margins consistently higher than those of neighboring plantations, achieved through careful analysis of market conditions, strategic timing of crop sales, and innovative cost reduction measures. The documentation confirmed that the Whitmore plantation's success had indeed been built on her intelligence and business acumen. The list of names and locations suggested that their escape had been part of a larger network of assistance that extended far beyond Virginia. Several of the names were later identified through historical records as known conductors on the Underground Railroad, indicating that their flight had been carefully planned rather than impulsive. These final documents provided closure to a case that had puzzled historians for generations. They confirmed the exceptional nature of Celia's intelligence while documenting the personal cost of operating within a system that could neither acknowledge nor accommodate such capability. The discovery generated renewed scholarly interest in the case and prompted additional research into similar situations that might have existed but remained hidden. Dr. Patricia Williams, who led the historical analysis of the discovered documents, concluded her 1964 study with an observation that captured the enduring significance of the case. The Whitmore plantation affair demonstrates that human intelligence and dignity will ultimately find expression, even within systems designed to prevent such expression. The tragedy lies not in the discovery of these qualities, but in the social structures that made their concealment necessary. Today, the highway that runs near the former plantation site carries thousands of travelers daily, most unaware of the remarkable story that unfolded in this quiet corner of Virginia. The traffic moves swiftly past farmland that shows no trace of the buildings where an enslaved woman once managed a successful business operation while legally classified as property. The case file, now preserved in the Virginia State Archives, continues to attract researchers interested in understanding the complexities of American history. The documents serve as evidence of intelligence and capability that transcended the limitations imposed by law and society, while also illustrating the personal costs of challenging established hierarchies. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Whitmore plantation case lies not in the specific details of what occurred, but in the questions it continues to raise about recognition, opportunity, and human potential. The story reminds us that history contains countless narratives of suppressed capability and denied intelligence, most of which remain buried in silence. The wind that moves across the Virginia countryside no longer carries the whispered conversations and secret correspondence that once characterized life at the Whitmore plantation. But it continues to carry the echo of a question that resonates across the centuries. How many other stories of hidden intelligence and thwarted potential remain buried in the silence of the past, waiting for discovery and recognition? On quiet evenings, when the light fades across the fields where tobacco once grew under Celia's careful management, the landscape itself seems to hold the memory of what occurred there. The soil that once yielded exceptional profits through her analysis and planning now grows different crops under different management. But the earth remembers what intelligence and capability, given the opportunity to flourish, could accomplish even within the most restrictive circumstances. The Whitmore plantation case stands as a testament to the enduring power of human intelligence to transcend the boundaries that society attempts to impose. It serves as a reminder that capability and wisdom can emerge from any circumstances, and that the greatest tragedy lies not in the existence of such qualities, but in the systems that prevent their recognition and development. In the end, Celia's story belongs not just to the history of slavery or antebellum Virginia, but to the broader human story of intelligence seeking expression and recognition despite overwhelming obstacles. Her legacy lives on in every instance, where capability is recognized regardless of social background, where partnership transcends artificial boundaries, and where intelligence is valued for its own merit rather than the circumstances of its origin. The silence that surrounds her final years speaks louder than any documented testimony could about the price paid by those who challenged unjust systems. But it also speaks to the ultimate triumph of intelligence and dignity over the limitations that others attempt to impose, and perhaps in that silence lies the most fitting memorial to a woman whose intelligence changed the course of a plantation, challenged the assumptions of a society, and continues to inspire questions about justice, recognition, and human potential more than 160 years after she disappeared into the mist of history.